Good morning again. This will be part 2 of Characteristics of Living Things 8, part 2. Life changes over time. I got to 14 minutes and I realized I should stop and make sure this was a bite-sized piece, and so here will be what I hope to be the second half. So I want to compare Athenian culture both to our really fast, really shallow media culture, and also say it's very different from our culture in that it's one where people can say, what is this strange new idea about Jesus and the resurrection? It occurs to me as you try to find a parallel to their relationship to gods or religions. It is something like our definition of meme. That is, they wanted each new religious idea to be this fun, short, exciting thing that leaves their attention span in favor of the next thing. So that's one thing if you're dealing with a bunch of false and imaginary gods. It is idolatry, but when we come to the idea of relating to Jesus that way, and I think that's a key to why Paul could be so emotionally moved by their ignorance. I think they wanted Jesus to be another I can has cheeseburger, another witty spiritual idea that holds their attention 3 seconds, pass on to their friends, go on to the next thing. And that is a profoundly disrespectful way to view God. Once again, the Bible almost never tells us people's emotions and what they're feeling. We just get words and we get actions. We don't have thought bubbles. The Bible would be much, much easier to interpret things like people's inner motivations if everything had thought bubbles like a comic book, and it doesn't. But we know that he is paroxystically angry. That's the term that is there to describe his feelings. A word that's very similar to paroxysm, being paroxystically like, almost like a tremor of anger. But he realizes this is a group of people he cannot reach with his usual methodology. He has been spending lots of time in the Jewish sanctuaries of towns and talking about the Messiah that they have become familiar with. Okay, here is what Isaiah says about Messiah. Here is what the covenants say about the need for a permanent sacrifice. So he says to them, doesn't talk about Messiah, doesn't talk about Genesis, doesn't talk about Old Testament prophecy, because these are people that are not going to be moved by that. I'll summarize for you the things he says. He says, this unknown God over here that you've been looking at and worshiping and hoping constitutes the missing piece of your God puzzle, he is the Lord of heaven and earth. He is spirit. Doesn't live in buildings, not worshipped with your hands, which refers to making of idols. Doesn't need anything from you. Gives life to all. He's turned a blind eye to your ignorance until today. But now is the time to repent. He had their attention. Some asked him to come back, but some believed. And I think those that would say, I don't believe yet today, were probably firmly in the camp of, I'm hoping this Jesus is another spiritual meme. Another I can has cheeseburger, says the cat with the big bushy eyebrows. It gives us a name of 2 people, Dionysus and Damaris, and then some others. Most of us would not engage conversationally with polytheists. It's a very far bridge to cross to find common ground, other than this idea that, well, there must be more than humanity, there must be divinity somewhere. That's a commonality that you have with polytheists, although it's a very different idea. Um, the Hindus I have known will say, that within a given family, they don't all worship the same gods. They have the choice, like a theological buffet. Um, if you know Wiccans, if you know witches, and I have known people that have shared those things about themselves, then you know uh, polytheists. Most of us would not engage that conversation. Most of us might even dismiss them as people because we're so offended by the belief system. Paul knew he could not talk to them like uncompleted Jews. He could not talk to them like the people he met in various synagogues throughout his journeys. He could only talk to them in the language they understood. He talked to them using their own polytheism and using their own idolatry to share Jesus with them. Because even belief in the wrong God and belief in plurality of gods is evidence of something. It's evidence of a human soul, which we all are, created for relationship with God. Now, we're obviously not born with a clear understanding of what that is, what that should look like, and so some of us have the privilege of being raised by believers and being raised in loving churches and being given the gospel in a way that we understand and are able to resonate with and respond to. And, some of us are going to be raised by atheists, and some of us are going to be raised by polytheists, and it is a much deeper water to cross to get to a point where there is gospel conversation possible. Paul understood that the message of the gospel is unchanging, but the method is constantly changing. That is, just as he could change the way he presented it for this group of Athenians, we are increasingly in a time where your neighbors are desensitized to tracts. Your neighbors are desensitized to knocking on the door, an invitation. And we're in a time where innovation must occur for the presentation of the gospel in the time we live in. We are living in a time where virtually 100% of church gatherings are occurring electronically. And as a person who is not immensely comfortable with technology myself, I find that a hard thing. I find that a steep hill. I miss seeing my brothers and sisters face to face. I see a few of them, and that's good. But I believe that it has to be that for the gospel to continue to be preached, there's people that are finding ways to do this electronically, despite the lack of personal direct contact, and finding ways to do it in an era where we're increasingly legally isolated from each other. I was noticing this week in a grocery store what an alien thing it is to not be able to tell if someone's smiling or frowning at me because they're wearing a face mask. And yet the gospel will not be thwarted by these things. That if you are someone who is struggling with those questions, how to present the gospel in these challenging times, then my heart is with you. I exhort you, whether it turns out the way it turned out for John Allen Chow on North Sentinel Island, or whether it turns out for you the way it turned out for Paul. By the way, it was not a landslide. It was not a massive conversion. It looks like this massive, this strong, creative, ingenious thing he does to modify the presentation. seem to have gotten him 3 or 4 converts. So there's not a strong like work to output relationship there, but nonetheless the Holy Spirit sees fit to mention it, as I think the actions of John Allen Chow will be mentioned in heaven. So life changes over time. The gospel itself is unchanging. The gospel method is ever changing to be a useful tool to those that are outside of the kingdom. Thank you. In Jesus' name.